There are corners of America where the land itself seems to remember the secrets people would rather forget. In the rolling countryside of eastern North Carolina, roughly 30 miles inland from the coast, once stood a plantation house demolished in 1952 for reasons that remain unexplained. No historical marker commemorates it. No family has claimed it for over a century. Yet for more than 150 years, locals whispered about what lay beneath its floorboards. Not treasure, not gold, but something far more disturbing. This is the story of the Harrington family, their sprawling estate, and the dark secret they buried beneath their home. A secret so profound that it has left questions unanswered to this day. The Harringtons arrived in North Carolina in 1783. Just as the American Revolution drew to a close. They were not among the first settlers. That distinction belonged to families who had claimed land decades earlier. But the Harringtons were ambitious, shrewd, and possessed a rare talent for acquiring property from desperate owners. The war had left many landholders financially ruined, their futures uncertain. Thomas Harrington, a merchant from Philadelphia who had prospered in the unpredictable shipping trade, saw opportunity where others saw collapse. Thomas was a man of sharp features and cold calculations, his slate-colored eyes giving nothing away. His demeanor always rigid. In his early 50s, he left the bustling streets of the North to establish a plantation in the South, and not out of love for farming, but for power, legacy, and control. His wife, Margaret, nearly 20 years younger, combined formidable beauty with sharp intelligence. Her looks were classically severe, her intellect often hidden behind a quiet composure. She managed the household accounts with precision and bore Thomas 4 children, 2 sons, William and James, and 2 daughters, Catherine and Eleanor. Margaret was the silent engine of the family, her influence subtle yet pervasive, observing all with an unerring eye. Thomas acquired approximately 800 acres of fertile land on a gentle rise overlooking a slow-moving river. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, particularly after summer rains, clinging to skin and clothing alike. The climate favored tobacco and cotton, and the river provided convenient transport. Construction of the Harrington house began in 1785 and took 2 years to complete. It was a substantial 2-story home with a full basement, built with bricks fired on site and timber harvested from the property. The house featured a central hallway, spacious rooms on either side, a grand staircase curving elegantly to the upper floor, and a wraparound porch facing south to catch the river breezes. The basement, however, was unusual. Unlike the simple, utilitarian cellars of other plantations, the Harrington basement was an extensive labyrinth of thick stone walls that seemed to swallow sound. The air was perpetually cool, even in the summer, carrying the faint metallic tang of rust. The most curious feature, however, was a sealed chamber beneath the main parlor, hidden behind a trapdoor blended seamlessly with the oak floorboards. Only someone with intimate knowledge and a specific tool could open it. When neighbors commented on the unusual size of the basement, Thomas dismissed their curiosity, insisting it was necessary for storage and structural integrity. Few pressed further. A man of his wealth and standing was not accustomed to being questioned. By 1800, the Harringtons owned over 120 enslaved people, their plantation a symbol of growing wealth. The rhythmic sounds of hoes on sun-baked earth, the distant spirituals, and the sharp, sweet smell of curing tobacco filled the air, a testament to their prosperity. William, the elder son, was volatile and restless, while James was quieter, ambitious in a subtle way. Catherine and Eleanor married into other prominent families, weaving a web of social alliances that strengthened the Harringtons' standing. Outwardly, the family appeared respectable, successful, and ordinary for wealthy planters of the era. They attended church, hosted lavish gatherings, and engaged in the social and political life of the county. Thomas even served as a magistrate, his judgments swift and severe. But beneath this veneer, whispers persisted. The rumors circulated quietly, mostly among enslaved people and sometimes free black individuals who had interactions with the family. They spoke of the sealed chamber beneath the parlor, a place where people vanished, not with dramatic violence, but silently, almost imperceptibly. Occasionally, a distant, muffled cry or heavy thud carried across the property, dismissed as the wind or an animal. When asked about missing persons, the Harringtons claimed they had been sold, had run away, or died of illness. No one questioned them. Their wealth and influence ensured that. Yet the whispers persisted, growing more precise with time, like ivy creeping into the cracks of silence. Accounts recorded later suggested that the sealed room was far more sinister than mere storage. Though the details were fragmentary and circumstantial, they hinted at horrors that exceeded even the brutal realities of slavery. The very air in the basement was said to carry a strange heaviness, cold and oppressive, tinged with a faint, indescribable odor that was not merely damp earth. One account recorded in the 1930s by a WPA interviewer speaking with an elderly woman named Dara, who had been born enslaved on a neighboring plantation, described the room as a place of confinement and experimentation. Dara, her voice raspy with age and memory, spoke of her grandmother's stories passed down in hushed tones of people being held in the sealed chamber for extended periods subjected to conditions of extreme deprivation. My grandmother, she say, folks went in there and they didn't come out the same if they came out at all. Ara recounted, her eyes distant. She mentioned in careful and oblique language that there were rumors of doctoring being performed, procedures that had nothing to do with healing. The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken, but understood, a chilling violation of the human body, not for cure, but for some unknown, sinister purpose. The grandmother had spoken of a pervasive chill that emanated from the house even in the height of summer, a coldness that seemed to seep into the very bones. Another account from a man named Tobias, who had escaped the Harrington plantation in 1812 and made his way north, described the room as a place of punishment so severe that it was rarely discussed even among the enslaved workers themselves. Tobias, interviewed years later by an abolitionist, spoke of the deep dark place where the master kept his special discipline. He recounted hearing on certain nights a faint rhythmic thudding sound like something heavy being dragged, followed by a profound unnatural silence. He spoke of people being removed from the room in states of such profound injury that they could no longer work in the fields, their bodies broken, their spirits extinguished. The memory of the muffled sounds, the feeling of dread that permeated the air around the main house had stayed with him for decades. A third account from a letter written by a white overseer named Josiah Crane, who had worked for the Harringtons briefly in 1815 and had subsequently moved to Georgia, described the room in even more disturbing terms. Crane, a man of practical, if not particularly moral sensibilities, wrote to a friend that he had been instructed never to enter the sealed chamber, and that when he had once glimpsed its interior through a partially open door, a fleeting moment of curiosity and terror, he had seen things that had convinced him to leave the plantation immediately. He did not specify what those things were, only that they were unnatural and against God's law. His letter conveyed a sense of profound horror and moral revulsion, a chilling testament to an unspoken evil. The memory of the sight, whatever it was, had left him with a persistent tremor in his hands and a haunted look in his eyes. He spoke of a smell, too, a clawing sweet odor that he could never quite place, but which he associated with the brief, terrifying glimpse. The accounts were fragmentary, second-hand, and impossible to verify with certainty. They were like pieces of a broken mirror, each reflecting a distorted but recognizable image. But they were consistent in one crucial respect. They all suggested that something deeply wrong was happening beneath the Harrington house and that the family was going to considerable lengths to keep it secret. The very silence surrounding the topic, the way conversations would abruptly cease when the house was mentioned, was a testament to the power of the unspoken dread. The Harrington family's fortunes began to decline in the 1820s. Not because of any scandal or exposure, but because of the simple, relentless economics of agricultural production. The rich, dark soil, which had yielded such bounty for decades, began to show signs of depletion. Its nutrients leached away by years of intensive tobacco and cotton cultivation. The cotton market, once a reliable source of immense wealth, became increasingly volatile, its prices fluctuating wildly with global demand and supply. Competition from other regions, particularly the newer, more fertile lands of the Deep South, increased steadily, driving down profits. By 1830, the plantation was still profitable, its fields still worked by a large enslaved labor force, but it was no longer the thriving, expanding enterprise it had been in the early years of the century. The crisp, clean lines of the ledger books began to blur, replaced by smudged figures and mounting debts. Thomas Harrington died in 1828 at the extraordinary age of 95. He had lived an exceptionally long life for the era, his will to power seemingly extending his very existence. His death was marked by a substantial funeral, attended by many of the prominent families of the region, who came more out of a sense of obligation and respect for his long-held influence than genuine affection. The air was heavy with the scent of lies and damp earth, a stark contrast to the acrid smell that sometimes emanated from his house. His will was read and his property was divided among his surviving children. The plantation itself, the heart of the Harrington legacy, went to his eldest son, William, who was then in his mid-50s. William Harrington was a different man from his father, where Thomas had been shrewd, calculating, and possessed of an almost chilling foresight. William was impulsive, prone to grand, ill-conceived schemes, and possessed a volatile temper that often clouded his judgment. He had inherited his father's wealth, but not his business acumen, nor his cold, unwavering control. He was a man of appetites, for fine liquor, for gambling, for the fleeting thrill of risk. Within a decade, the plantation's financial situation had deteriorated significantly. The fields, once meticulously managed, began to show signs of neglect. The rows less straight, the weeds more prevalent. William made increasingly desperate decisions in an attempt to restore profitability. He expanded the workforce through purchase, taking on substantial debt. Believing that sheer numbers would compensate for poor management, he experimented with new unproven crops that failed spectacularly, leaving fields barren and resources wasted. He invested heavily in ventures that produced no return, his money vanishing into the pockets of unscrupulous speculators. By 1840, the Harrington plantation was in serious financial trouble. The grand house, though still imposing, began to show subtle signs of wear. A loose shutter, a patch of peeling paint, a faint dampness in the corners of the rooms. William was in his 60s, his health failing, his once robust frame now stooped, his face etched with worry and the ravages of drink. He had no clear plan for recovery, only a desperate hope that some grand stroke of luck would save him. His sons, Thomas Jr. and Edward, were young men in their 20s and 30s, and they had inherited their father's impulsiveness without his initial advantages. They saw the decline, felt the tightening grip of debt, but lacked the experience or the will to reverse the tide. The weight of their father's failures and their grandfather's dark legacy pressed down on them. It was during this period of decline that the sealed room beneath the house seems to have fallen into disuse. The whispers about it did not cease entirely, but they became less frequent, less specific, fading into the background hum of daily life. It was as though the room itself had become a kind of historical artifact, a remnant of an earlier, darker era that was gradually being forgotten, or perhaps simply neglected. The Harringtons, consumed by their financial woes, likely had neither the time nor the inclination to continue whatever grim activities had once taken place there. The air in the basement, though still cool and damp, no longer carried the same pervasive sense of dread. Merely the smell of old earth and disuse. And then, in the spring of 1847, something happened that would bring the room and its secrets back into terrifying focus. The sky, which had been a brilliant oppressive blue for weeks, turned a bruised purple, and the air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken threat. In the spring of 1847, a severe storm unlike any in living memory passed through the region. It arrived with a sudden violent fury, tearing through the landscape with torrential rains and howling winds that stripped leaves from trees and sent branches crashing to the ground. The sky turned a bruised, ominous purple, and the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and damp earth. The storm raged for 3 days, causing widespread flooding in the low-lying areas of the county, turning roads into muddy rivers and fields into shallow lakes. The Harrington Plantation, situated on higher ground, was spared the worst of the flooding, but the relentless downpour did cause significant damage to the grand house itself. Water finding its way through compromised mortar and ancient timbers seeped into the basement, forming shallow pools on the stone floor and leaving streaks of dampness on the thick walls. The air in the basement became heavy, cloying, thick with the smell of wet earth and mildew. The family was forced to undertake repairs, a costly and unwelcome expense given their already strained finances. William Harrington, his face drawn with worry, ordered his overseer to direct a crew of enslaved men to clear the water and assess the damage. It was during these repairs that a worker, a man named Samuel, who was enslaved on the plantation, discovered something unusual. Samuel was a man of quiet observation, his eyes missing little, his hands skilled and steady. He moved through the damp echoing basement, his bare feet splashing softly in the shallow water, the chill seeping into his bones. As he cleared debris from a particularly dark corner, his gaze fell upon one of the thick stone walls. It was a section that seemed to have been built with a slightly different kind of mortar, a subtle variation in color and texture that only a keen eye would notice. The storm's relentless assault had found a weakness here. A section of the mortar had cracked and partially crumbled, revealing a narrow, jagged gap behind the wall. A faint, unsettling draft, colder than the surrounding air, seemed to emanate from the opening, carrying with it a faint, indescribable odor. Samuel paused, his heart quickening. He had heard the whispers, of course, the hushed tales of the deep, dark place beneath the master's house. He knew the stories, the fear they instilled. He hesitated, a cold dread creeping up his spine, but the overseer's sharp voice from another part of the basement spurred him on. He reported his discovery to Garrett Hutchkins, the overseer, a man who had been employed by the Harringtons for approximately 5 years. Hutchkins was a man of limited imagination but considerable practical sense, his face perpetually set in a grim, unyielding expression. He was known for his efficiency, his lack of sentiment, and his unwavering loyalty to his employers, a loyalty often purchased with a comfortable wage. Hutchkins, annoyed by the interruption, strode over, his heavy boots echoing on the stone floor. He examined the wall, his brow furrowed. Just a bit of settling, Samuel, he grunted, dismissing the subtle difference in mortar. He determined that it posed no immediate structural threat, merely cosmetic damage. Get it patched up, don't waste time. But before the repairs were completed, a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps a vague memory of some long-forgotten instruction from William Harrington, prompted him to investigate what lay behind the damaged section. He knelt, peering into the narrow gap, the faint cold draft brushing his face, carrying that same unsettling odor. He reached in, his fingers brushing against rough cold stone. Then something else, something softer, yielding, a shiver, not entirely from the cold, ran down his spine. He ordered Samuel and the other men to step back. Then, with a crowbar, he carefully widened the breach, prying away the loose stones and crumbling mortar. The opening widened, revealing a small, dark chamber, sealed off from the rest of the basement by the thick stone wall. The air that rushed out was stale, heavy, and carried a distinct cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers mixed with something metallic. The chamber was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with a low-arched ceiling barely tall enough for a man to stand upright. It contained no furniture, no equipment, nothing that would suggest any legitimate purpose. It was simply a void, a space of profound emptiness. But it did contain something else. As Hutchkins held up a flickering lantern, its weak light struggling against the oppressive darkness, he saw them. Human remains. Not fresh, no, but undeniably human. They were scattered on the damp earth floor, partially covered by fallen debris and a fine layer of dust. The bones were discolored, some fragmented, but the unmistakable shapes of skulls, ribs, and femurs were visible. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay, a smell that seemed to cling to the very fabric of his clothes to seep into his skin. There were multiple bodies, at least 3, possibly more, their forms indistinct in the gloom. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, and it was impossible to determine with certainty the cause of death or the identity of the deceased. The silence in the basement became absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of Hutchkins and the terrified, barely audible gasps of Samuel and the other enslaved men. Garrett Hutchkins, faced with this horrifying discovery, made a decision that would have profound and lasting consequences. He did not report the remains to the authorities. The thought, fleeting and terrifying, crossed his mind, but was quickly suppressed by a wave of self-preservation. Instead, he ordered Samuel and the others to remain silent, his voice low and menacing, his eyes promising dire consequences for any who spoke a word. Then, his face pale and grim, he reported his discovery to William Harrington. What happened next is unclear. The historical record is silent on the details of the conversation between Hutchkins and Harrington. One can only imagine the hushed urgent tones, the fear, the desperate calculations, but the outcome is documented. The sealed chamber was resealed. The damaged section of wall was repaired with fresh mortar, meticulously, carefully, as if to erase the very memory of the breach. The remains were left undisturbed, entombed once more in their dark, silent prison, and Garrett Hutchkins was paid a substantial sum of money, enough to purchase a small farm of his own in a distant county, and left the Harrington plantation, never to return. The money was a heavy weight in his pocket, a constant reminder of the secret he now carried, a secret that would haunt his waking hours and his dreams. What is truly remarkable about the discovery of the sealed chamber in 1847 is not that it happened, but that it was kept secret. In the modern era, the discovery of human remains, particularly multiple sets, would trigger an immediate, thorough, and public investigation. But in 1847 in rural North Carolina, the situation was far more complicated, far more susceptible to the insidious power of silence and complicity. The air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken agreements, with the weight of shared knowledge that dared not be uttered. The Harringtons were, despite their recent financial struggles, still among the most prominent families in the county. William Harrington, though burdened by debt and a failing constitution, still wielded considerable social and political influence. His name carried weight. His connections ran deep through the local gentry, the magistrates, and even the state legislature. An investigation into the remains would have raised questions that no one, not the Harringtons, not the local authorities, not the community at large, seemed willing to answer. It would have been a stain, not just on the Harrington name, but on the very fabric of the respectable society they inhabited. The thought of such a scandal, the whispers turning into shouts, was intolerable. Moreover, the remains themselves presented a profound problem. If they were the remains of enslaved people, as was almost certainly the case, then their discovery would raise deeply uncomfortable questions about what had happened to them, how they had died, and why they had been hidden. These were questions that, in the context of 1847 America, were deeply threatening to the established social order. The institution of slavery depended on a certain willful ignorance about its brutalities, a carefully constructed facade of paternalism and order. The discovery of bodies hidden beneath a planter's house threatened to pierce that ignorance in a way that was deeply disturbing to the entire system. It hinted at a darkness that went beyond the accepted cruelties, a darkness that could unravel the very foundations of their society. And so the discovery was not reported to any official outside the immediate circle. The sealed chamber was resealed. Its new mortar a stark pale line against the older weathered stone, a physical manifestation of the lie. The remains were left undisturbed. Their silent testimony buried once more, and the secret was kept. William Harrington, his face a mask of grim determination, ensured that Garrett Hutchkins was well compensated and swiftly removed from the county. A loose end tied off with a generous purse. The enslaved men who had witnessed the discovery were threatened with severe repercussions should they ever speak of what they had seen. Their fear, a powerful muzzle. The air on the plantation grew heavier, thick with unspoken dread, a palpable tension that settled over the fields and the cabins. But secrets, particularly secrets of this magnitude, have a way of persisting. They do not disappear simply because people agree not to speak of them. They linger in the collective memory of a community, passed along in whispers and fragments, distorted and elaborated over time, but never entirely forgotten. They become part of the very air, a subtle chill that permeates the warmest days, a shadow that falls even in the brightest sunlight. The silence was not an absence of knowledge, but a deliberate collective act of forgetting, a heavy blanket thrown over an inconvenient truth. The Harringtons and those who knew lived under the weight of that blanket, their lives forever shadowed by the knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. The decades following the resealing of the chamber in 1847 were years of profound silence, but not years of peace. For the Harrington family, the silence was a heavy shroud, muffling their lives, pressing down on their spirits. The financial decline of the plantation continued its inexorable slide. William Harrington, already a man prone to anxiety and ill-temper, seemed to wither under the weight of the secret. His once boisterous laugh became a rare, strained sound, his eyes perpetually haunted. He would often be found pacing the parlor late at night, his footsteps echoing faintly above the very spot where the trapdoor lay hidden. The scent of stale whiskey and fear clung to him. William Harrington died in 1852, a broken man, his last years consumed by a quiet, gnawing dread. The plantation, a shadow of its former glory, passed to his eldest son, Thomas Jr., who was then in his early 40s. Thomas Jr. was a man of his time, a slaveholder, a staunch Confederate sympathizer, a man who believed implicitly in the righteousness of the Southern cause and the inherent order of their society. But he was also a man who seemed to carry a particular, almost pathological burden of anxiety about the family property, especially the basement. According to accounts from people who worked on the plantation during this period, Thomas Jr. was obsessive about the basement. He would inspect it regularly, his lantern casting long dancing shadows on the stone walls, his breath misting in the cool, damp air. He would run his hands over the section of the wall where the chamber was hidden, checking the mortar, ensuring that it remained intact, that no new cracks had appeared. He seemed to live in fear of the wall being breached, of the chamber being discovered again, of the family's carefully constructed facade crumbling into ruin. The very thought of it brought a cold sweat to his brow, a tremor to his hands. He would often descend into the basement alone, staying for hours. The only sound, the drip of water and his own ragged breathing, as if communing with the darkness below. When the Civil War began in 1861, Thomas Jr. was in his 50s. He served in the Confederate Army, though not in any particularly distinguished capacity, his age, and his anxieties keeping him from the front lines for long. He survived the war and returned to the plantation in 1865 to find it largely intact physically but economically devastated. The enslaved people had been freed. The labor system that had sustained the plantation's wealth had collapsed and the South itself was in ruins. Its economy shattered. Its social order overturned. The fields, once vibrant with crops, lay foul or overgrown with weeds. The barn stood empty. The grand house itself seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. The air was thick with the dust of defeat and the bitter tang of uncertainty. The Harrington family, like many planting families, struggled desperately to adapt to the post-war world. Thomas Jr. tried to implement a sharecropping system, but the land was exhausted, the capital scarce, and the spirit of the former enslaved people, now freedmen, was no longer bound to his will. The plantation was eventually sold off in pieces, parcel by parcel, to cover mounting debts and taxes. The grand furniture was auctioned. The family silver melted down. By 1880, the Harringtons no longer owned the property. The house itself, a hollow shell of its former grandeur, was purchased by a man named Robert Caldwell, a merchant from Raleigh, who had made his fortune in the chaotic, opportunistic post-war economy. Caldwell was a pragmatic man driven by profit, but also by a keen sense of curiosity. He had heard the faint, persistent rumors about the old Harrington place, whispers that had survived the war and the decades of silence, and he was intrigued. Robert Caldwell's purchase of the Harrington estate in 1880 was not merely a financial transaction. It was an acquisition fueled by a peculiar blend of ambition and curiosity. Caldwell was not a planter, nor was he a man of sentimentality. He was a shrewd merchant from Raleigh, a self-made man who had navigated the turbulent waters of the post-war economy with remarkable success. He saw the old Harrington house not as a decaying monument. A local newspaper, the Raleigh Observer, published a brief sensationalized account of the discovery, describing it as a most disturbing and mysterious affair and calling for a thorough investigation. The article, though short on details, hinted at dark deeds and long-buried secrets, fueling the already rampant speculation. The community buzzed with hushed conversations, old rumors resurfacing with renewed vigor now given a terrifying tangible reality. An investigation was indeed conducted, but it was not thorough. The county sheriff, a man named William Garrett, no relation to Garrett Hutchkins, the former overseer, was dispatched to the Harrington estate. Sheriff Garrett was a man of his time, a product of the post-Reconstruction South, more concerned with maintaining order and protecting the reputations of prominent families than with uncovering uncomfortable truths. He arrived with a small retinue, his face grim, his demeanor radiating an air of official solemnity. He examined the remains, which by now had been exposed to the air for several days, their state of decomposition making identification nearly impossible. The sealed chamber, now fully open, was a stark, chilling sight, its stone walls seeming to absorb all light and sound. The pervasive, cloying smell of decay still lingered, a silent testament to its grim history. Sheriff Garrett interviewed Robert Caldwell, who recounted his discovery with a precise factual tone, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the sealed chamber. He also questioned Elias Thorne, the carpenter, whose testimony was more colored by local folklore and a palpable sense of dread. The sheriff then interviewed several elderly people who had worked on the plantation during the Harrington era or whose families had, but their accounts were fragmented, often contradictory, and heavily influenced by decades of rumor and fear. Many were reluctant to speak, their eyes darting nervously, their voices barely above a whisper, clearly terrified of repercussions, even after so many years. But the investigation quickly stalled. The remains were too decomposed to be identified with certainty. There was no clear evidence of how the bodies had come to be in the sealed chamber or how long they had been there. The medical knowledge of the era was insufficient to provide definitive answers regarding the cause of death. Beyond the obvious conclusion that they had perished in confinement, there was no definitive evidence of foul play that could be legally proven, though the circumstances were certainly suspicious to anyone with an ounce of common sense. And crucially, there was no one alive who could be held legally responsible for whatever had happened. Thomas Harrington was long dead. William Harrington was dead. Garrett Hutchkins had vanished decades ago. The chain of accountability had been broken by time and deliberate obfuscation. Moreover, there was considerable pressure, subtle but unmistakable, to close the investigation and move on. The Harrington family, though no longer prominent, still had connections and influence. Their surviving descendants, though distant, were still part of the intricate web of Southern society. Other prominent families in the county had been associated with the Harringtons through marriage and business dealings, and they feared the ripple effect of a full-blown scandal. The idea of a thorough investigation into what had happened in the sealed chamber threatened to expose uncomfortable truths about the entire social and economic system that had sustained the antebellum South, a system many were still trying to rebuild, or at least romanticize. It threatened to reveal the dark underbelly of their Gentile society, to shatter the illusion of order and benevolence. And so, after a few weeks of perfunctory investigation, the matter was officially closed. Sheriff Garrett issued a statement vague and carefully worded, concluding that the deaths were unfortunate and likely the result of unspecified illnesses during a period of poor record-keeping. The remains were given a quiet, unmarked burial in a pauper's field, not in the family cemetery. Their identities and stories forever lost. The sealed chamber was filled in with brick and mortar, this time permanently, its entrance obliterated. The house was sold again, this time to a family named Whitfield, who had no connection to the Harringtons, and crucially no knowledge of the history of the property beyond the vague, unsettling rumors. They were told the house had been cleansed. The Raleigh Observer published a final brief notice stating that the investigation had concluded and that the matter had been resolved to the satisfaction of the authorities. No further details were provided. The community, eager to return to its comfortable illusions, quickly absorbed the official narrative, pushing the disturbing truth back into the shadows. The silence once broken, had been meticulously, deliberately re-established. But the memory, like a persistent weed, would find ways to grow through the cracks. But the discovery of the remains, brief as the public attention to it had been, had ensured that the secret could not be entirely forgotten. The official pronouncements, the carefully worded newspaper articles, the swift resealing of the chamber, none of it could truly erase the visceral shock of what had been found. The story of the sealed chamber and the hidden bodies became a part of local folklore, a chilling tale whispered around hearths on cold winter nights, passed along in fragments from one generation to the next. It was a story that grew and shifted with each telling, distorted and elaborated. But its core, its unsettling truth, remained intact. The very air around the old Harrington place seemed to hum with unspoken history, a subtle chill that even the warmest sun could not dispel. By the early 20th century, the Harrington house had changed hands several times. It had been used as a residence, a boarding house for itinerant workers and at one point a small short-lived school, but it retained its reputation as a place of darkness and mystery. Local people avoided it, their gazes sliding away from its decaying facade. Children were warned away from its overgrown grounds, told tales of bad spirits that lingered there. Stories about it circulated in the community. Stories about strange muffled sounds heard at night, like distant cries carried on the wind, about people who had lived in the house and had subsequently suffered misfortunes, their lives inexplicably blighted, about the sealed chamber and the bodies that had been found there. A grim reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. The house itself seemed to breathe, its old timbers groaning, its windows like vacant eyes, staring out at a world that had tried to forget it. In the 1920s, a local historian named James Whitmore became intensely interested in the history of the Harrington house. Whitmore was a school teacher by profession, a man of quiet demeanor and sharp intellect, his spectacles perched on his nose, his hands often stained with ink. He was an amateur historian by passion, driven by a profound belief that the past, however uncomfortable, must be understood. He had grown up hearing the whispers, the fragmented tales, and they had ignited a spark of curiosity that had never truly extinguished. He found himself drawn to the property, its decaying grandeur, a silent challenge. Whitmore began to conduct interviews with elderly people in the community, meticulously recording their recollections in a worn, leather-bound notebook. He spent countless hours in dusty county archives, poring over old land deeds, tax records, and faded newspaper clippings. He sought out the descendants of those who had worked on the Harrington plantation, listening patiently to their stories, sifting through layers of memory, fear, and inherited trauma. What Whitmore discovered was a complex and deeply disturbing picture. The accounts he collected were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, colored by the passage of time and the subjective nature of memory, but they were remarkably consistent in suggesting that something profoundly wrong had occurred in the sealed chamber, and that the Harrington family had gone to considerable lengths to keep it secret. The pervasive fear, the reluctance to speak openly, was a testament to the enduring power of the past. One of Whitmore's most important interviews was with a woman named Martha Daniels, who had been born enslaved on a neighboring plantation and who had lived through the entire period of the Harrington family's prominence. Martha Daniels was in her late 90s when Whitmore interviewed her. Her skin like parchment, her voice a fragile whisper, but her mind, though occasionally wandering, held flashes of remarkable clarity. She sat by a crackling fire, the scent of wood's smoke filling the small cabin, her gnarled hands clasped in her lap. "The Harringtons," she began, her eyes distant. "There was a cold kind of folk, always had a shadow about him, even in the brightest sun. According to Martha Daniels, the sealed chamber had been constructed deliberately by Thomas Harrington, not as a storage space, but as a place of confinement, a punishment room, as her own grandmother had called it. She spoke of people being taken into the house and not emerging, and of rumors that they had been subjected to conditions of extreme deprivation, of being starved of light and air. She mentioned in careful, almost coded language that there were whispers about doctoring being performed, procedures that had nothing to do with healing, but rather with making folks quiet, making them forget. The implication, though unspoken, was chilling, a systematic dehumanization, a violation of mind and body. Martha Daniels also provided a crucial piece of information, a specific memory that resonated with the earlier accounts. She spoke of a particular incident that had occurred in the early 1820s when she was a young woman. According to her account, a man named Samuel, a skilled carpenter who had been enslaved on the Harrington plantation, the same Samuel who would later discover the chamber in 1847, had been taken into the house and had not emerged for weeks. When people asked about him, they were told that he had been sold to another plantation, a common enough lie. But Martha Daniels had heard rumors from her own kin who worked closer to the main house, that Samuel had been taken to the sealed chamber, and that he had died there under circumstances that were never explained. They said he knew too much, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Saw things he shouldn't order seen. The memory of Samuel's disappearance, the sudden profound silence that followed, had stayed with her for nearly 8 decades. A cold knot of fear in her memory. Whitmore, listening intently, felt a profound sense of dread and confirmation. The fragments were beginning to coalesce, forming a terrifying, if still incomplete, picture. The persistence of memory, even in the face of deliberate erasure, was a powerful, unsettling force. As the 20th century progressed and James Whitmore's research began to circulate, various theories emerged about what had actually happened in the sealed chamber beneath the Harrington house. These theories were not wild speculations born of sensationalism, but rather careful constructions based on the fragmentary evidence that had been collected, the accounts that had been preserved, and the grim historical context of the era. The ambiguity, however, remained a persistent shadow over every explanation. One theory proposed by Whitmore himself and later supported by other historians was that the sealed chamber had been used primarily for the confinement and severe punishment of enslaved people who had resisted, attempted to escape, or otherwise defied the Harringtons' absolute authority. The extreme conditions of confinement, the sealed walls, the lack of ventilation, the profound darkness, the isolation from all human contact would have made it an effective tool of terror and control. A psychological weapon designed to break the spirit as much as the body. The bodies found in the chamber could have been the remains of people who had died from the conditions of confinement, succumbing to starvation, dehydration, or disease in the suffocating darkness. Or more chillingly, they could have been the victims of punishments administered by the Harringtons or their overseers, their deaths then concealed to avoid any external scrutiny. This theory aligned with the accounts of disappearances and the general atmosphere of dread that surrounded the Harringtons. The smell of decay, the scattered bones, all spoke to a deliberate hidden cruelty. Another theory, more disturbing and more speculative, yet grounded in the grim realities of the period, was that the sealed chamber had been used for purposes related to medical experimentation. In the 19th century, particularly in the American South, there was a significant and horrifying amount of medical research being conducted on enslaved people, often without their consent and frequently with fatal results. These experiments, driven by a perverse blend of scientific curiosity and racial dehumanization, were rarely documented and almost never faced public scrutiny. Some historians suggested that the Harrington family or perhaps a physician associated with the family, perhaps a relative or a trusted acquaintance, may have used the sealed chamber as a clandestine space for conducting such experiments. The accounts of doctoring and making folks quiet from Martha Daniels and others lent a chilling credence to this idea. The cloying sweet smell that Garrett Hutchins had noted combined with the metallic tang could be interpreted as the lingering scent of chemicals or bodily fluids. The deliberate secrecy, the hidden nature of the chamber, would have been ideal for such illicit practices. A third theory, less widely accepted but still discussed in hushed tones, was that the sealed chamber had been used for purposes related to occult or ritualistic practices. This theory was based largely on the sealed nature of the chamber, the profound secrecy surrounding it, and the fact that some of the more fragmented accounts mentioned strange procedures or unnatural things being performed. The idea of a prominent family engaging in such practices was deeply unsettling, hinting at a depravity that went beyond mere cruelty. However, there is no concrete evidence to support this theory, and most serious historians, including Whitmore, dismissed it as speculation, a product of fear and the human tendency to invent explanations for the inexplicable. While the psychological horror was undeniable, the supernatural was firmly outside the realm of verifiable history. What is clear based on the available evidence is that the sealed chamber was used for purposes that the Harrington family considered so shameful, so dangerous, and so utterly beyond the pale of acceptable society that they were willing to go to considerable lengths to keep them secret. The exact nature of those purposes may never be definitively established, the truth forever obscured by time and deliberate obfuscation. But the evidence strongly suggests that they involved the systematic confinement, punishment or harm of enslaved people, a profound violation of human dignity hidden beneath the veneer of Southern gentility. The ambiguity itself became a source of enduring horror, forcing each listener to confront the darkest possibilities of human nature. As the 20th century progressed, the Harrington house itself became an increasingly decrepit and forlorn figure on the landscape. It had been built well with solid brick and sturdy timber, a testament to Thomas Harrington's initial ambition, but it had not been properly maintained for decades. The grand facade, once a symbol of wealth and power, now sagged under the weight of neglect. The roof, its slate tiles cracked and missing in places, leaked relentlessly, allowing rain to seep into the attic and trickle down through the walls, leaving dark, spreading stains on the plaster. The once elegant wraparound porch, its columns leaning precariously, was rotten in places, its floorboards soft and treacherous. The air around the house was perpetually damp, carrying the heavy scent of decaying wood, mildew, and the faint metallic tang that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath it. By the 1930s, the house was barely habitable. Its windows, many of them broken or boarded up, stared out like vacant eyes. The once manicured lawns were overgrown with weeds and thorny bushes, reclaiming the land with a wild, untamed vengeance. The interior was a ruin. Wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, revealing layers of faded patterns from different eras. Plaster crumbled from the ceilings, littering the floor with dusty debris. The grand staircase, once a symbol of upward mobility, groaned and creaked with every step, its banister loose and splintered. Cold drafts swept through the empty rooms, carrying the dust of decades and the faint, unsettling echoes of forgotten lives. During the Great Depression, the house was briefly occupied by a family of poor white farmers, the Millers, who had been displaced from their own land by drought and economic ruin. They were desperate, seeking any shelter they could find, but they did not stay long. According to accounts from people who knew them, the Miller family left after only a few months, snorts, abandoning what little they had, claiming that the house was haunted or cursed. They spoke of strange sounds at night, muffled thuds from below, faint, disembodied whispers carried on the drafts, the distinct cloying smell that would sometimes fill the parlor, even when no windows were open. They spoke of a pervasive sense of dread and unease, of feeling watched and threatened by an unseen presence that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the house. The children in particular were terrified, refusing to go into the basement, claiming they heard crying from the ground. The Millers, though pragmatic and hardened by hardship, could not endure psychological torment the house inflicted. By the 1940s, The house was essentially abandoned. It stood empty, slowly deteriorating, a gaunt, skeletal monument to a dark and shameful past that the community preferred to forget. Its decaying presence was a constant unsettling reminder, a physical scar on the landscape that refused to heal. The local authorities considered it an eyesore, a hazard, and a magnet for vagrants and curious teenagers. In 1952, the decision was finally made to demolish the house. The official reason given was that it was structurally unsound, a danger to anyone who might venture inside, a fire hazard. But there was another reason, one that was never officially stated, but was widely understood by anyone who had lived in the county for long. The community wanted to erase the physical reminder of the Harrington family's crimes, to remove from the landscape the tangible evidence of a shameful chapter in the region's history. The house was a wound that refused to close, a silent accuser. Its destruction was an act of collective amnesia, an attempt to finally bury the past once and for all. The demolition was carried out quickly and efficiently. Heavy machinery, a symbol of modern progress, tore into the old brick and timber. The sounds of splintering wood and crumbling masonry echoed across the fields, a violent final punctuation mark to a long, dark story. The house was torn down, its materials removed, and the site was leveled, left empty, a flat, scarred patch of earth. The sealed chamber, which had been filled in decades earlier, was utterly destroyed in the process. Its contents, whatever they might have been, pulverized and scattered. Any remaining evidence of what had occurred, was obliterated, reduced to dust and rubble, scattered to the winds. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing that with the house gone, the secret would finally be gone, too. 12. The aftermath. The demolition of the Harrington house in 1952 was intended to be an act of finality, a definitive erasure of a painful and unsettling past. The community, weary of the whispers and the lingering shadow the house cast, hoped that by removing the physical structure, they could also remove the memory of what had occurred there. The leveled ground, now covered in a thin layer of new grass, was meant to symbolize a fresh start, a clean slate. But the demolition did not erase the memory of what had occurred there. The story persisted in local folklore, passed along in whispers and fragments, distorted and elaborated over time, but never truly silenced. It became a ghost story without a ghost, a horror without a monster, a chilling tale of human depravity that lingered in the collective consciousness. By the late 20th century, the story of the Harrington house had become a kind of local legend, a cautionary tale told to frighten children or to illustrate the dark secrets that could be hidden beneath the surface of respectable society. Most people no longer believed that it was literally true, or at least they preferred not to. It had become, in the popular imagination, a ghost story, a tale of the supernatural rather than a historical account of human cruelty and institutional complicity. The details blurred, the facts softened, replaced by the more palatable fiction of spectral hauntings and unexplained phenomena. It was easier to believe in ghosts than in the profound systemic evil that had once resided there. But for historians and researchers, particularly those interested in the history of slavery and the insidious mechanisms by which communities maintained silence about atrocities, the story of the Harrington house remained profoundly significant. It illustrated in concrete and disturbing detail how a community could collectively choose to ignore evidence of profound wrongdoing, how institutions could be manipulated to protect the powerful, and how the physical destruction of evidence could be used to erase historical truth. The story served as a stark reminder that history is not merely a collection of facts, but a contested narrative, often shaped by those who seek to conceal as much as by those who seek to reveal. The sealed chamber beneath the Harrington house was never fully explored or examined by modern methods. The remains found there were never identified. The stories of those individuals were lost forever, swallowed by anonymity. The circumstances of their deaths were never determined, and the questions raised by the discovery of the chamber remain unanswered, leaving a gaping void in the historical record. The truth, like the scattered bones themselves, had been fragmented, obscured, and ultimately buried beyond reach. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the story is that the Harrington family's secret was never fully exposed, either in a court of law nor in the light of public scrutiny. What happened in that hidden room remains incomplete and contested. We have fragments of evidence, accounts from people who claimed knowledge of the events, theories shaped by historical context and human empathy, and conjectures born of fear and imagination. But certainty eludes us. Closure is impossible. We are left only with the unsettling knowledge that a profound wrong occurred, and that a society, whether actively or passively, conspired to ensure that the full truth would never be known. Silence, once a tool of concealment, became permanent. The story of the Harrington house raises questions that are not merely historical, they are echoes of human suffering and systemic injustice. What was the sealed chamber used for? Was it a place of confinement, a suffocating prison meant to break the will of the defiant, a site of brutal punishment, where the Harringtons enacted their cruelest forms of discipline in secret? Or, more chillingly, a clandestine laboratory where human beings were reduced to objects of experimentation, their bodies violated in the pursuit of profit or twisted curiosity? Fragmented accounts, pervasive fear, and deliberate concealment all suggest a purpose so horrific it defied even the brutal norms of the era. How many died there, and who were they? Multiple sets of remains were documented in 1847, and their presence was confirmed again in 1888. But were these the only victims? Could there have been others, whose bodies were disposed of elsewhere, or so thoroughly destroyed that no trace remained? Each fragment represents a life, a family torn apart, a name erased from memory. How did the Harringtons justify their actions to themselves? Did Thomas Harrington, the cold, calculating patriarch, view it as a necessary means of maintaining control and wealth? Did William, his impulsive son, inherit not only property but also moral corruption, becoming complicit through fear or a warped sense of duty? Were conversations about the chamber held openly, with chilling pragmatism, or were they shrouded in a conspiracy of silence, a dark, unspoken bond of guilt shared among them? And what of the wider world? How many other hidden chambers exist, secret atrocities buried under the soil of the American South, or anywhere power has been wielded without accountability? How many families, institutions, or communities chose silence over truth, reputation over justice, allowing unimaginable acts to be erased from history? The Harrington house is a microcosm of a larger historical reality, a reminder of both human cruelty and societal complicity. The sealed chamber was eventually filled in and destroyed. The house itself was demolished in 1952, and the remains were interred in an unmarked grave. But the questions remain. The mystery endures. The uncomfortable truth persists. Respectable families and entire communities were capable of concealing profound atrocities, and the echoes of those acts linger in the quiet corners of history. Today, the land where the Harrington house once stood lies empty, undeveloped for more than 70 years. Locals avoid it, though few can explain why. Some claim it simply lacks value, others speak of a lingering unease, a subtle chill that hangs in the air even on warm days, as if the land itself remembers. The trees around the perimeter seem to lean inward, their gnarled branches guarding a secret that no one dares to uncover. In recent years, a handful of historians and researchers, inspired by the pioneering work of James Whitmore, have attempted archaeological surveys of the site. They have used ground-penetrating radar, meticulously sifted the soil, and documented anomalies, but their efforts are limited. The 1952 demolition pulverized the sealed chamber, scattering its contents and any evidence it might have held. The land keeps its secrets tightly, and perhaps it always will. The story of the Harrington house and its hidden chamber remains one of history's most unsettling mysteries. It challenges our understanding of community, exposes the mechanisms by which societies maintain silence about atrocities, and reminds us how the past continues to haunt the present too, even when all physical traces have vanished. Even more than 170 years after the initial discovery, the truth remains incomplete. Who died there? Why? and how the Harrington family justified the chamber's construction may never be fully known. The full horror is left to the imagination, a void each listener must fill with their own darkest fears. But in the persistence of these questions lies a kind of truth. Some secrets, once buried, can never be entirely forgotten. They linger in collective memory, haunting the landscape long after the structures that concealed them have vanished. The Harrington house is gone. The sealed chamber is destroyed. The remains are lost. Yet the story endures, a chilling testament to the power of silence, the persistence of wrongdoing, and the haunting reality that beneath the surface of respectable society, darkness often waits. The land remembers, quietly, forever. What do you think of the story of the Harrington family and the sealed chamber beneath their house? Were the remains victims of confinement and punishment, or did something even darker occur? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of historical mystery and forgotten crimes, subscribe and hit the notification bell to uncover more. Share this tale with someone who loves dark history and unsolved mysteries. And if you're from North Carolina or the surrounding region, we'd especially love to hear it.